Our speaker today, of course, is going to talk to us about the desegregation of Baltimore City schools, but I'm going to hand over the introduction for our speaker to Lisa Auction, who is a member of the Baltimore City School Board and the Associate Vice President for Marketing and Public Relations here at UMBC. Well, Lisa.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
Thank you, Chris, for inviting me and Delana to give this introduction. And Chris and Delana think that I'm giving this introduction because I sit on the Baltimore City School Board, but really the more resonant reason for me is that Professor Baum was my teacher, advisor, and mentor in the Urban Planning Master's Program at College Park. And I hope for the students in the room, you know that you always want to honor those who have really helped you learn and develop and engage the world, and Professor Baum is really that kind of person for me. I'm delighted that he's here today. Professor Baum's first book, or most recent book rather, Brown in Baltimore, that we're going to discuss today, has important insights to offer into a pivotal period in the history of the city of Baltimore and its public schools. Some of us lived through the Brown decision. Many more of us in this room were born after the ruling, but I think we're all aware of the long-term effects the decision had on the composition of classrooms in the city of Baltimore and the composition of neighborhoods, because those two things are very related. As a current member of the Board of School Commissioners in Baltimore, I can tell you that we continue today to grapple with the effects of the decision that the board made in 1954 as we work to raise academic standards and achievement in what is now, sadly, one of the least diverse school systems in the nation. This is a district in which 88% of the students are African American, and more relevant to the question of achievement, 83% are poor. So as you hear the story today and what people had in mind in making this decision, keep in mind what sort of the outcome has been so far. Professor Baum is a member of the faculty of the School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation at the University of Maryland, College Park. He earned a PhD from Berkeley in City and Regional Planning after earning a bachelor's and master's degree in political science and American civilization. His research frequently looks at issues of community planning and development through the lens of political theory, race relations, and organizational behavior. He's been deeply involved with the issues and questions surrounding Baltimore public schools for years. In the early 90s, along with a team of other colleagues and students, he was a participant observer in a community planning process in Southeast Baltimore that explored ways to achieve family engagement in local schools. That work led to the establishment of a full-service community school at Tench-Tillman in the city, and his 2003 book, Community Action for School Reform. He is also the author of The Organization of Hope, Communities Planning for Themselves. While Baltimore often provides the source material for Dr. Baum's research, his work is read and respected nationally. And best evidence of that is during the course of his preparing this book, he was recognized with the prestigious Guggenheim Fellowship that helped support his work on Brown in Baltimore. Talking about what Professor Baum has done is only half the story. As his former student and advisee, I find how he does it also very inspiring, and I think that's also another important lesson for our students, that the how is really ultimately more important than the what. His work is a model of engaged scholarship. He is observing political and community theory in action in forums that range from elite boards to grassroots groups. So Dr. Baum is not at all an ivory tower scholar. He is doing his research in the midst of action in communities and on the ground. And even with his deep knowledge of theory and planning history, what is really most fun and refreshing and inspiring about Howell is he comes to each project and each student's comment or paper with a humility and a genuine curiosity that invites productive discussion. As a student, I always felt that we were treated as colleagues and we were the richer for it. And so please join me in giving a warm welcome from UMBC to a great thinker and teacher, Howell Baum.
Thank you very much. It's a lovely introduction. Thank you really very much. I teach an undergraduate class at College Park called Diversity in the City, and for the last couple of weeks, in the beginning of the semester, I've been talking about school segregation and housing segregation, and at some point a student said, people don't talk about these things anymore. You know, nobody uses these words integration, segregation anymore. It's a strange language. And I said, yes, you're saying something really important, which is the conditions haven't changed so much, but it's no longer defined as a public issue. And that's a puzzle for us to try to understand. So I'm going to talk about history, and the history will go back, as you'll see, some number of decades. But I think the history is in some sense also contemporary, and I think we're still left with lots of lessons. We may have fewer resources to work with the same conditions, but I think we're left with lessons and a lot of questions to address. So I'm going to tell you a story and then invite you to talk with me about the story, and let's see what we can get from it. It's a story of good intentions that were frustrated. And Baltimore school officials wanted to end segregation, but they tried to do so without talking about race. And I think as a result, they adopted a desegregation plan that had limited impact on segregation. And so I regard this as a puzzle. I'm not sure why. And so what I want to look at and invite you to look at with me is to try to understand the beliefs and the feelings that supported segregation to begin with, why it is people wanted segregation, why it is they wanted to maintain segregation, and why they resisted desegregation. I think we need to understand that to begin with. And then I think we need to look at why and how public officials and community leaders avoided talking about these things. And let's see what lessons we can draw from that. I'm going to tell you a story about 120 years in about 30 minutes. So I'm going to leave off lots of events, and we'll see how we do. I'll arbitrarily start the story in 1867. Just after the Civil War, Maryland adopted a new constitution which directed Baltimore City and all the counties to provide for public education for black children as well as for white children. So the city of Baltimore took over a network of private schools for black children and began to run separate and clearly unequal public schools, starting in 1867. Let me say a little bit about what schools looked like in Baltimore City in the early 20th century. Baltimore had prided itself on spending a very small amount of money on schools anyhow, so the schools weren't in great condition, but the schools for black children, the so-called colored schools, were significantly worse than the schools for white children. Buildings were decrepit, they were unsanitary, a number of them had rats, a number of them were fire traps, a number of them lacked indoor plumbing, a number had poor lighting, heating, or ventilation. A number of them had coal stoves for heat, which is both unsafe and unsanitary. They had a shortage of supplies, a shortage of books. Some even had a shortage of chairs. So there were schools in which two black children might sit in the same chair. The schools were clearly overcrowded, and a number of black children had to attend schools on shifts, less than a full-time day. What I would just add is a number of these schools had once been schools for white children, and the school board had declared them no longer fit for white children, changed the numbers of the schools, changed the names of the schools, and reopened them as schools for black children. Beginning in the mid-1930s, a small group of black leaders launched a campaign to improve the education of black children. And key actors in this were Lily Mae Jackson, who helped revitalize the Baltimore branch of the NAACP in about 1935, and Carl Murphy, who was the publisher of the Baltimore Afro-American newspaper, and he was also active in the NAACP. And they pushed to equalize black schools to make them as good as white schools, saying essentially, if you're going to have separate schools, we insist that they be equal, and we're going to make segregation more expensive for you. So throughout the 1940s, the NAACP publicized the squalid conditions in black schools and made specific proposals to school officials for improving the schools. And consistently, school officials did nothing of any significance in response. In the late 1940s, in about 1947, black officials finally said, it's enough with equalizing schools, we want to end segregation altogether. And as most of you, I imagine, know, Thurgood Marshall, who at this point was the head of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund in New York and was developing cases to bring before the Supreme Court. He'd come from Baltimore. He was in touch with people in Baltimore. They saw the direction the national NAACP was moving, and they said, it's enough. We really want to end segregation of schools altogether. And then something remarkable happened in 1952, and we're moving toward the court decision. In 1952, the Baltimore Urban League got an idea. And they said, why not apply for, turned out to be 16 black boys to attend Poly High School, which had an elite pre-engineering course called the Poly A course. And the course was so good that graduates of this program, when they would go to college, like MIT and other places, would be admitted as sophomores. So it was a good program, and it had a good reputation. And the Urban League said, and the NAACP came in with them on this, and they said, it's impossible to have an equal separate program. It's impossible to create a brand new separate program for blacks that would be equal. Therefore, the city has to admit blacks to the Poly A course. So there was a 4-hour school board meeting and lots of talk and overflow crowds and serious discussion, and the school board agreed and said there couldn't be an equal separate program. And so in 1952, 2 years before the Brown decision, the Baltimore School Board admitted 16 black boys to Poly High School, essentially ending segregation in an elite school in Baltimore City. And then the black leaders, again, because they were in touch with Thurgood Marshall, said, Supreme Court decision is coming, we're organizing, we want to strategize to influence the Baltimore school officials. So they invited school officials to come to their offices, and they said, look, this is what we want. If the Supreme Court decision comes down favorably, we want you to move immediately to desegregate schools. And what we want is not just desegregation of students, but we want desegregation of teachers. Because at that point, black teachers taught only black students, white teachers taught only white students. They said we want mixing of both. Then finally, May 17th, 1954, with no advance announcement, Earl Warren announces a unanimous 9-0 Supreme Court decision, Brown versus Board of Education, which says separate schools are inherently unequal schools, they're unconstitutional. Within a week, the Baltimore School Board voted unanimously, 8 whites and 1 black, to end segregation in Baltimore City. Started in 1867, it's now 1954. And then a week later, they unanimously adopted a particular desegregation policy, and it had a number of peculiarities. So here's where I want to pay attention to details. And the subsequent history of school desegregation in Baltimore has a lot to do with these details. The policy was a policy of freedom of choice or open enrollment, which meant any child was free to transfer to any school the family chose. Or let's put it differently, integration would be voluntary. It would depend on the choices of black families, but in particular, it would depend on the choices of white families, whether they would choose to send their children to school with black children. The school board went on to say, the race of the child shall not be a consideration in where the child goes to school. And they meant, one thing they meant was the school board would no longer use children's race to send them to separate schools. But they also meant something else. They meant that they would no longer consider students' race at all. In an effort to end segregation, they would imagine students had no race whatsoever. They wouldn't consider students' race in devising any remedy for segregation at all. So the assumption was students had no race, no racial identity. They weren't influenced by racial history. No one's choice in this free choice program would be influenced by their racial identity. It's as if everyone was just an individual, just a raceless individual. So the Baltimore desegregation policy was one in which there were 150,000 students, all assumed not to have any race, all set free with the encouragement, choose to transfer to any school you like. And the superintendent, John Fisher, shortly afterwards said, oh, school officials really don't care what kinds of racial makeup results from all this. All we care about is that students have a choice. So if students have a choice, we're indifferent, officially, publicly, we're indifferent to whatever the racial makeup is that results from this. Well, let's set the stage a little bit more. Someone who lived in Baltimore in 1954. Are there any of you here who lived in Baltimore in 1954? Okay, I'm good. I'm glad there's at least one. I think those who lived in Baltimore in 1954 might have made three kinds of observations about how this free choice policy was going to play out. The first one is something I've already hinted at, which is that the historically black schools were outmoded, they were dilapidated, they were unsafe. Meaning no parent, whatever their race, whatever their racial views, would choose these schools if there were an alternative. That's the first thing. Second thing is, it was difficult for black teachers to get good training as teachers. So that many black teachers were not as well trained as many white teachers. My institution, the University of Maryland, made serious efforts to keep, well, they made successful efforts to keep blacks out of the University of Maryland. And the state of Maryland, as some of you may know, had a policy like many other border states and many southern states, which said, we will give scholarships to blacks to go to college outside the state. So blacks from Baltimore, from anywhere in Maryland who could apply to, get accepted at colleges elsewhere, could get scholarships to go to elsewhere. And a number of blacks from Baltimore, including those who wanted to become teachers, went to good places like Columbia, NYU, Wisconsin, Oberlin, Penn, and a variety of good institutions. And a number of them came back, became teachers, and presumably were well trained as teachers. But the majority of blacks in Baltimore who wanted to become teachers in Baltimore had otherwise the choice of going to Coppin, which was, until 1939, had a 2-year program to train teachers, a segregated program. Whites went to what is now Towson State University. Coppin was poorly funded. The facilities were run down. Teachers were poorly trained, poorly paid. The library wasn't worth the name. People were well motivated. People were strongly committed to teaching well, but the teaching institutions to train them weren't well funded, and that was a handicap. So as parents look at the schools and look at the historically black schools with many of these teachers in those schools, and since the school board had no intention of desegregating teachers, white parents at least would think, whatever their views about education, they weren't sure these were schools they wanted to choose because of the difficulties these teachers had in getting good training. Third thing is, Baltimore City was a thoroughly segregated city in 1950. Blacks didn't ride at the back of the bus. Blacks voted, but otherwise, it was as segregated as any city in the South around the country. Very few whites and blacks had contact with one another. People might have done business together, people might have employed someone of the other race, but by and large, blacks and whites didn't have contact with others of the other race. They didn't have associates. Few had friends of the other race. So there was a great deal of anxiety at the racial boundary. Great deal of anxiety about crossing the racial boundary, making it unlikely that many people, whatever their racial views, whatever their educational preferences, would choose schools associated historically with the other race. So a couple things I think one might keep in mind. One is that historically black schools presented limited choices. And the other one was few families felt emotionally free to choose schools associated with the other race. Now, the school board could have renovated or replaced historically black schools. It could have integrated faculties. It could have provided training for teachers. It could have had human relations efforts to try to deal with people's anxieties and sort out which worries are realistic, which worries aren't realistic, give people information, help people make informed choices, and encourage people to act on the basis of reality rather than fantasies. School board did none of these things, as if these racial problems didn't exist. Let me say some important things at this point in the story about the views of blacks in Baltimore at this time. Black leaders in the NAACP had urged the school board to adopt the policy it adopted. When the board adopted it, the NAACP issued a press release taking credit for persuading the school board to adopt open enrollment. Black leaders endorsed open enrollment for 2 decades. And this is really quite unusual because very few blacks in America anywhere favored free choice as a desegregation policy. Also, what's important to the story is, unlike almost any other school district you want to name, no civil rights group ever sued the school board in Baltimore after 1954 to do anything other than have free choice. So really quite extraordinary circumstances here. I want to quote from the Afro-American. The Afro-American was the voice of the middle class, of the black middle class. They spoke to the black community. They also presumed to speak for the black community. So there's a lot of talk about we and us and our. So the school board adopts a policy, and I just want to read a little bit from the Afro story which describes it. The headline says, "Integration means more opportunities." And what they were talking about is more opportunities for black individuals, not for the race as a collectivity. The article notes that different children have different abilities and different needs. I'm just going to read a sentence here. It says, "The Baltimore school system maintains schools and general classes to fit the needs of the average child, whether a formal or vocational career is planned. The same for children with superior ability and for those whose ability is limited." So there was a sense that desegregation finally meant enabling individual black children to differentiate themselves. So the distances between them would in fact increase as each child had an opportunity to rise to whatever his or her level was. The publisher's daughter, Betty Murphy Phillips, had an opinion column every week in the Afro. And I just want to read a little bit from her first column following the adoption of this new policy. She says she looks forward to, quote, "the next 15 years when we get all our young people, white and colored, to stop thinking in terms of race. Thank goodness the Baltimore School Board has taken the first step by abolishing racial designation in assignment of pupils." In other words, she's taking the same position as the liberal school board in saying, let's disregard children's race from here on out and proceed as if everyone is simply an individual. And what's important to emphasize here is no one is demanding that the school board actively move to mix black and white children in the same schools. In other words, the Afro and black community leaders are taking the same position as the school board is, which is children should have choice of schools free of coercion by government. That's the policy. Okay, I've taken a lot of time to set the stage, and the question is, well, what happened? How did it play out? So let's go to the first semester of desegregated schools in the fall of 1954. School system has 150,000 students, 60% white, 40% black. Out of 58,000 black students, little under 3% choose to go to historically white schools. And most of those doing the choosing were from middle class and elite black families. Among the 87,000 white students, and the numbers are hard to pin down, so I'll use the higher number. Out of 87,000 white students, 6 chose to go to historically black schools. If you're doing the math, it's 0.007%, or pretty close to 0. Well, let's let a few years go by. So we'll look in 1958, after 4 years, people get a chance to get used to this policy. They see how it plays out. It becomes normal. They have something to react to. So we'll look in 1958 now, 4 years later. At this point, a quarter of Baltimore black students are in formerly white schools. And of 86,000 whites, 58, that's 0.07%, are in historically black schools. In other words, it's still very close to 0. I think the pattern is set by this time. This is really 4 years, but I think the pattern of Baltimore desegregation is pretty clear. There's modest desegregation, it's temporary, followed by resegregation, meaning historically white schools become predominantly black and then all black. White parents continue to move out of Baltimore, take their children out of Baltimore City schools for lots of reasons, some of them related to schools, some related to other things. And the city schools become increasingly and more deeply segregated. In 1960, school system becomes majority black, and still no one, neither whites nor blacks, are advocating for direct action by school officials to mix students by race. I can tell the subsequent history quickly because really this is the story here, but there are a couple interesting events that take place. Let's skip ahead about 5 years. In 1963, a group of 28 black and white parents who called themselves 28 Parents, joined by the local and national NAACP, complained that the schools remain segregated. And they said it's not just that they continue to be segregated, but the school system is acting in ways that contribute to the continuing segregation of the schools. And the result was black children really had fewer choices than white children. And black children tended to be concentrated in a small number of schools that were overcrowded, and they attended schools part-time on shifts rather than full-time. So there were a number of practices they objected to, but one of them was really at the core of this free choice policy. It had to do with how the transfer program was administered. So there were a number of anecdotes which add up to the following kinds of things. There were stories about white schools with white principals where black children would transfer in a few at a time. And then there'd be points at which white principals would say to white parents, I think it's time for you to transfer your children out. Or there would be examples of where black parents would go to the principal of the child's school and say, I'm interested in transferring my child out to this other school. And the principal would say, I don't think you have a good educational reason for doing that. I'm turning it down. Or it wouldn't be good for your child to travel a long distance to go to that other school. Therefore, I'm turning it down. Or there would be examples of where black parents would make a request for transfer. The transfer would go to the school they wanted the child to go to, and the principal would either turn it down or put the child on a waiting list from which the child never emerged. So there was an accumulation of these kinds of practices which essentially limited the choices of black children. So the NAACP said, we'll sue the school board. And the parents said, look, we know these people. Let's see if we can negotiate. And what's an important part of the story is no one is asking for anything more than truly free choice. And the school board believes in truly free choice. So they said, OK, we will stop these practices. We'll open up choice. Choice will become fully free. That's OK with us. And the parents said, yeah, that's OK with us, too. But at this point, a decade's gone on. Pattern's been set. People have an idea about what free choice means. And not lots is going to change. Let me give you a couple quick numbers. This will be from 1965, so it's after 11 years. Give you a sense of the racial makeup of Baltimore schools. The numbers will be for elementary school children. 1965, black elementary school children, 5 in 6 attended schools that were at least 90% black. 2 of 3 white elementary school children attended schools at least 90% white. So black children who wanted racially balanced schools for their children, either because they believed in integration or because they perceived that schools with lots of white children get good resources and therefore their children ought to be in those schools. Whatever their reason, they had difficulty choosing racially balanced schools for their children when white parents wouldn't make complementary kinds of choices. In other words, their ability to choose schools with white classmates were limited by white parents' unwillingness to choose schools with black classmates for their children. So on paper, everyone had equal choice, but it was clear that in reality, some people had more choices and they had better choices than others did. Let me summarize this in two different ways. I'm going to say the same thing in two ways. One is we can say free choice failed in a couple respects, which is it didn't significantly and lastingly desegregate schools, and it didn't noticeably stem white flight. Okay, I'm going to say the same thing again differently. White parents were withdrawing their children from the city public schools despite the fact that lots of their children had little contact with black classmates. So I think that's a fact worth our thinking about in terms of thinking about what are the challenges of desegregating schools. Let's speed ahead a little bit in time and hit a couple more highlights and then look back at what's happened. Let's take ourselves to the mid-1960s. It's a time of civil rights activity in Baltimore as around the nation. People in Baltimore as well as around the country are saying, we have questions about free choice. It's just not a good policy. Baltimore City then hires two superintendents who are integrationists, and they both believe in busing, though they both recognize Baltimore parents don't want busing, but they work hard at trying to integrate schools. In the 1967 mayoral election, school integration is the big issue. There's talk about whether Baltimore City schools and Baltimore County schools should somehow go in together and desegregate schools on a metropolitan basis. The county's not real excited about that, but this is part of the talk. There's talk about busing. One of the people who's concerned about busing and who ends up one of the losers in this election is Peter Angelos, who was the city councilman at that time, and he had to go buy a baseball team and occupy himself in other ways, so his career took a different turn. But the winner in the election was Tommy D'Alessandro III. He'd run on an integrationist platform. He had openly solicited black support in the city. He got black support in the city, and he set out to improve and integrate the schools of the city. Very excited. So he starts up in the beginning of 1968, and on April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King was killed. And Baltimore saw the first racial riots the city had ever had, and blacks and whites were both disturbed. And finally, the riots ended, and Governor Spiro Agnew summoned 100 moderate black leaders to his office in Annapolis. Most of them had been on the streets trying to quiet people for several days, hadn't slept much, and looked forward to being thanked by the governor. Instead, the governor starts off and says, you think you're moderates, but you've endorsed these ideas, and you've contributed to the violence, and you're responsible for the riots. And he's going on and on and on, and as he goes on like this, the blacks walk out one by one by one. And then finally, when it's over, Agnew gets hundreds of telegrams from whites who say things like, thank you for saying what the white man thinks, and you should run for president. The old people here know that Spiro Agnew was, some of the rest of you may know as well, was vice president under Richard Nixon and forced to resign because he pled guilty essentially to taking bribes while Baltimore County executive, and even took bribes while sitting in the White House. So he never became president, but at least that was the wish of the people who sent him telegrams in 1968. It was really a watershed event. Whites were frightened by the riot and backed off from supporting integration. Blacks were discouraged by Agnew's peroration and by the telegrams that went to Agnew and really thought it's not worth trying to push anymore. And yet, those of you who study history know there's all kinds of ironies of timing. So just weeks after the riots, the Supreme Court comes down with a new decision in response to an NAACP lawsuit. And the decision is about free choice. And the decision says, free choice is unconstitutional unless it really integrates schools. Giving people choices doesn't count. You have to have results that white and black children end up going to school together. So the question is, what does this mean for Baltimore? So someone asks Baltimore City Solicitor George Russell to offer a formal opinion about what's the implications of this for Baltimore school desegregation. George Russell was the first black city solicitor in Baltimore, appointed by Mayor D'Alessandro. And he went to D'Alessandro and said, you know, if I do this, it's going to be controversial. And D'Alessandro says, do it. So George Russell grew up in segregated West Baltimore. He went to segregated schools. He liked all black schools. He was not a fan of integration. And yet he said the Supreme Court is really quite clear here. Baltimore's school desegregation policy is constitutionally inadequate. Baltimore needs to have a different policy. So the mayor, who had encouraged him to say something and who appointed the school board, ignored this. And Francis Murnahan, who was the president of the school board and became a distinguished federal court judge later on, said, he talked about all the difficulties with integrating schools and says, I'll defer to the superintendent. And then Thomas Sheldon, who was a brand new superintendent, had only been in town for a month, come from Long Island, trying to get along with staff he hadn't appointed, who were skeptical about him. He's all involved in this and says, I haven't seen the court decision, I haven't read the opinion, and when I do, I'll get back to you. So he didn't. But one person did speak up, the city council president, William Donald Schaefer. Some of you may know he later became four-term mayor of Baltimore, became governor, became comptroller, and now lives down the road at Charlestown. He said he was talking a lot about why he wasn't going to talk about the Supreme Court decision and why he wasn't going to talk about school desegregation policy. And the answer is, he says, is if you do that, immediately the question of race comes in. He's right. And he didn't want to talk about race. And Baltimoreans all said, we are happy with free choice. It doesn't require us to talk about race. We don't want to talk about race in general, but we certainly don't want to talk about it right after the riots. I'm going to skip ahead now 6 years, and we're almost at the end of the story. But finally, in 1974, the Federal Office for Civil Rights says to Baltimore, as to 84 other school districts, either you develop an integration plan that really integrates city schools, or you're going to lose federal education money under the Civil Rights Act of 1964. At this point, city schools are 70% black, so the arithmetic is not favorable to integrating schools. Roland Patterson, who's the first permanent black superintendent, says, free choice is really quite an adequate policy. Don't talk with us about anything else. Black and white school board members say, we really like free choice. It's a good policy for us. It'll work. Only the NAACP and the Baltimore Afro speak strongly about integration and say we're willing to have busing if that's necessary to integrate schools. So the Baltimore School Board develops a very modest integration plan that doesn't affect a lot of students. Federal government says that's not good enough. They negotiate back and forth for about a year and a half. The Office for Civil Rights then says, we're going to move to take away education funds from Baltimore City. At this point, William Donald Schaefer is mayor. And in January of 1976, he sends city lawyers to federal court to get an injunction against the Office for Civil Rights so it can't take money away from Baltimore schools. And the city's lawyers say, you know, Baltimore needs peace and space and time to integrate schools in ways that are consistent with local conditions, local customs. We know best how to do this. We need to do it at our own pace. And I'm going to make a long, interesting court history real short. In the middle of 1976, the district court issued an injunction against the federal government saying you can't take money away. They appealed, and then in 1978, a circuit court split 3-3, saying essentially the injunction sticks. So in the middle of 1978, Baltimore City has won. Federal courts say the federal government may not take money away from Baltimore City, regardless of what the makeup of schools is. So at that point, that's really the end of the battle. And following that moment, the Baltimore School Board proceeds never again to do anything further to desegregate students. there follows a decade of fruitless and toothless negotiations where people in Washington, trying in good faith, without any sticks to wield, try to make proposals, try to get people in Baltimore to integrate, and sometimes a year goes by without a returned phone call. So finally in 1987, and this is the end of the 120-year story, the U.S. Department of Education sends a letter to Baltimore Superintendent Alice Pinderhughes saying, and now the schools are 80% black. They send a letter to Alice Pinderhughes saying, we certify that Baltimore City has done everything it could have done to end all the vestiges of legal segregation. The end of the story. I want to talk a little bit about how we might think about the story, and then I'll give you a chance to talk as well. I think what's striking about this story is that although desegregation was concerned with race, there was very little talk about race. I mean, if you read the newspapers, there was constant obsessional counting of how many whites and how many blacks in each school. Everybody talked about that a lot, but nobody talked about what made people so anxious about the count. In other words, what the count really meant to people. No one talked about what had caused and maintained segregation in a thoroughly segregated city for 90 years following the Civil War's end. And essentially, nobody talked about what made whites so anxious about blacks. So there were a number of realistic questions that parents might have asked about desegregation that never got discussed. I'll give you some examples quickly. One kind of question was why it was that so many black students had lower test scores than white students. The NAACP talked about this some, and they had their own ideas about it, but it wasn't a publicly discussed question. Parents might ask how children from different cultural or class backgrounds with different educational preparation would interact and affect one another's learning at schools if they were mixed together. Or parents might ask whether children from different racial and class backgrounds would get along in school without endangering one another or without distracting one another from learning. Parents might ask whether teachers had training and experience to teach in racially mixed schools. Parenthetically, teachers were surveyed, and black teachers felt more confident about that than white teachers did in response to the survey. People had questions, black parents had questions about if their children went to school in white neighborhoods, would their children be safe? And white parents had questions about if their children went to school in black neighborhoods, would their children be safe? By and large, these questions were never really publicly discussed. At the same time, I think whites and blacks had lots of concerns about desegregation that were occasionally expressed but not really discussed. And centrally, white parents were really concerned about physical intimacy between their children and black children. I don't think Baltimore white parents are different from whites anywhere else in America, but I'll give you some examples from Baltimore. And we'll just try a few of them. After the schools were desegregated, the school board received a number of complaints from white parents that their children had gotten diseases from black children by sharing the same toilet seats. There were complaints about mixed swimming. White and black children were in the same water together. There was a tremendous amount of talking about dancing, whether whites and blacks would dance together. There was a white mother of a child, a 6th grade girl at Oliver Cromwell Elementary School. It had been an all-white school. After the first year of desegregation, it was a 50-50 school, and she anxiously went to the principal and said, who's going to be my daughter's partner for the Virginia Reel? And the principal said, children choose their own partners. But a tremendous amount of talk about whether whites and blacks would dance together, and anyone who was asked, whether it was a student or an adult, would always reassure everyone that no, they wouldn't. But just to play it safe, some schools canceled dances. And some schools simply said no more dances will be held on school ground. One particularly strange incident took place at Western High School. In the locker room, there were black and white girls showering in the showers. And white girls were staring at the black girls, and at some point one of the black girls said, "And what are you looking at?" And one of the white girls said, well, we'd heard that blacks have tails, and we wanted to see where your tails were. I'm going to give you one more example, and the purpose is not to make you feel uncomfortable, but simply to give you a sense of what was in the minds of people, of white people, as they anticipated how school desegregation might play out. So I'm just going to give you one other example, and it's from a letter just after this policy was adopted, from a letter in the Evening Sun. And what's interesting is Baltimore had an evening newspaper, 1954. I mean, that's really the most interesting part of this. But in any case, I'm going to read a letter from this woman to the Evening Sun. And she says she's expressing, quote, the thoughts of the average white person living in a community where we are surrounded on all sides by Negro people. And she's talking about what she calls the social aspects of desegregation. Then here, I'm going to read a couple sentences. She says, will my child have to go to a school prom and dance with colored children? Where will these things lead? Suppose we do tell our children that everyone is alike, that these people who have only 300 years of civilization behind them are the same. Then a son or daughter brought home a Negro boy or girlfriend. Would you be happy? Suppose they marry. Would you be happy wondering whether your next grandchild would be black or white? I don't think these are extraordinary sentiments in the sense that I think these were common sentiments among whites in lots of places. But I think these kinds of very primitive anxieties were foremost in lots of people's minds. And they were linked to every question about race, so that if someone starts to ask one of these practical, realistic questions, which I just identified a moment ago, immediately comes up in their mind the thought of, it's connected to all of this other stuff. And I don't know, we don't know if it's possible to talk about these realistic questions without all the rest of this stuff coming in. And then if I or someone else gives voice to the rest of that, how chaotic will it be? And will we be able to contain anything? And therefore, it's better none of us should talk about anything about race. I think something like that helped to discourage any kind of realistic talk about racial questions that might have made it easier for people to make some different choices than the ones they made. Well, let's get back to the thing that puzzles me. I think it's central to the puzzle, which is school board members were well-intentioned, they were educated, they acted in good faith, they were sophisticated people, and yet they chose this policy that ignored race, made desegregation voluntary, based on family choice. How come? Let me first say something in parentheses. What's important to keep in mind is these people were doing something no one else had ever done. There wasn't a cookbook where you go on page 148 and it says, when you want to desegregate a school, you do the following 4 things. There wasn't a precedent. There wasn't a history. They were inventing practices no one had done before. So in that sense, we can't say, why didn't they try what someone tried elsewhere in 1962? Because that hadn't happened yet. So I think we need to keep in mind that they were making it up from scratch, but it doesn't avoid the question of why did they choose what they chose, even in that context. I think there are 3 kinds of reasons. One of them is something I haven't said yet, which is free choice, open enrollment was the historic policy in Baltimore City. Going back to the 19th century, Baltimore had open enrollment. Any white child could transfer to any white school. Any black child could transfer to any so-called colored school. I mean, obviously, there was a boundary there, but Baltimore didn't have zones, mandatory attendance zones. Parents could make choices for their children going back a long period of time. Now there's a big difference when you can choose any particular school, but in some sense, they were continuing an idea that seemed reasonable historically going back to the 19th century. But I think there's a second set of considerations, which was school officials' anxieties talking about race and dealing with race. And I think this traditional policy served their psychological interests and their political interests in not talking about race in several ways. It's a policy that seemed least likely to provoke white resistance in that it didn't force anything on white families. Also, it removed school officials from responsibility for intervening in race relations or dealing with race. And the emphasis on choice as a process over any particular outcome meant that the school board didn't have to monitor what happened because what happened didn't matter in a formal sense. Also, this emphasis on individual choice, it's a choice of single individuals, meant that it wasn't even necessary to talk about race. So that's the second set of considerations. But I want to talk about a third set. And I want to talk about school officials' liberalism. They were liberals in the mid-19th century, thinking in culturally normal ways as liberals thought. And I think their choices, the policy they adopted, was a natural reflection of common sense ways of thinking in mid-century, 20th century. And I think they thought in ways that are still typical in important ways of American liberalism. Let me give you an example. In 1954, John Fisher was superintendent. He became superintendent in 1953, and a reporter from the paper went to him and said, "Tell me about your political views." So he said, "They go back to the founding fathers. My views come from them." And then the words here are the words of the reporter, but let's assume they're a fair paraphrase of his. He says, "Government should be as decentralized as possible, with as high a degree of local autonomy as can be achieved." He goes on to say, "The present tendency to do things collectively should be counteracted by providing more opportunities for individual initiative." So I think in his statement, there's three kinds of assumptions he makes that most of the school officials would have agreed with, and their policy really embodies these assumptions. Let me just go over each of them quickly. One has to do with the nature of society. In the liberal view of the world, society consists of self-interested, independent individuals. They're not part of groups. They're not influenced by groups such as races. They're simply autonomous individuals. And along these lines, school officials saw children simply as individuals, without racial identities, not influenced by racial identities or racial histories. Liberals approach, then there's a question of how do you decide who gets what if people have different preferences? If people have different interests and different values, so they're conflicting, how do you make decisions? The liberal answer is, let's not focus on the results, the outcomes, because people disagree about those, but let's design a process that seems fair. So we'll give everyone the right to choose, and let's assume it comes out okay, but let's focus on simply this process of choosing rather than concerning ourselves with the results. And that's just what the school officials did in Baltimore. They emphasized this process of choosing. They said they didn't care about the outcome. They saw no need to regulate or limit individual choices. And lastly, the role of government, as liberals see it, should be a limited role. Government shouldn't get in the way of individuals figuring out what's in their interests and acting to achieve their interests. And that's what the school desegregation policy was. It was one where school officials who wanted all children to make free choices saw no reason to intervene and didn't intervene. So I think there are three sets of complementary reasons about why school officials favored this policy, even though it didn't do what they said they wanted it to do. Let me say a little bit about why I think blacks favored this free choice policy, because I think that's also a puzzle. I think black leaders supported this policy for similar reasons, though they obviously took race far more seriously than white liberals did. Also, and I think this is real important, free choice worked for middle-class blacks and for elite blacks. They were the leaders of the community. It worked for them and their children in this way. They saw a larger world. They could see past the white world past the black world into the white world. They had some confidence entering the white world. They negotiated with white officials. They knew some white officials. They had the confidence that they could more or less securely send their children to school out in that larger world. In addition, they had the money to do it. And money mattered in two ways. Baltimore City had a policy of free transfers, but not free transportation. so that if a parent chose a school for a child that was across town, they had to have the money to pay for public bus fare, or they had to have private transportation to get the child to the school. So that's a significant amount of money. The second way money matters, and it may seem trivial, but it's not, is middle-class families could afford nice clothes for their children, so there was never going to be a worry about, will my child be embarrassed about how he or she looks going to school with middle-class white children. So middle-class blacks and elite blacks had the confidence, the mental map of the world, and the financial resources to take full advantage of this free choice policy. So it seemed like a good one in those terms. Also, I think they appreciated the fact that this emphasis on individual choice avoided talk about race. Less said, the better off everyone is. Also, they appreciated the fact that it didn't seem to force anything on whites, and that seemed least likely to provoke whites to resist. Also, I think schools had been segregated for 87 years. I think many blacks didn't want anyone, including even a growing number of black school officials, to tell them where to go to school. Finally, there were some blacks who preferred all black schools. They were significant social institutions. Teachers were, this is the old days, teachers were celebrities in the neighborhood. These parents liked all black schools for cultural and social reasons. What the new policy did was not force them to give up these schools, but it removed the coercion that made them go to schools, those schools, and it removed the stigma of going to all black schools. So I think there are a variety of kinds of reasons why blacks also supported these policies. Let me get to the end, and then let's do some talking. I think in this story, American liberalism had two complementary functions in the history. One is, I think it made it very hard for school officials to recognize or find language to talk or even think about race. But I think also thinking in these normal, culturally normal, common sense terms about raceless individuals was also very reassuring for those who didn't want to think about race. So on the one hand, it made it hard to think about race, but those who didn't want to think about race could be normal, and race somehow just didn't appear. So I think normal American liberalism tacitly, unconsciously led and enabled school officials to develop a policy to end school desegregation that didn't directly deal with race. So I think the effect was wasn't simply not to talk about what mattered about race, but also to make these matters undiscussable, something that policy just didn't have to address at all. So that white anxieties about blacks, which I think are really central to this whole story, become something not to be discussed, something just taken for granted. They're parameters to work within and work around. They're not obstacles to be challenged or conditions to be changed in developing policy. I think that's crucial to the story, even though the Supreme Court had said back in 1954 that separate schools were inherently unequal and therefore unconstitutional. Let me summarize, and this is the end, and I just want to emphasize two main themes in the story. One is that liberal school officials, acting in good faith, held two irreconcilable values. One was the value of integration, and you think of integration as a goal, as an end, and individual choice, which you can think of as a means or a strategy. In fact, this strategy doesn't get to this goal, but they really didn't weigh these very much. They didn't think very deliberately about it, but in the end, they simply said, we give priority to individual choice. And I think that's an important part of the story. Last thing, the second theme is, I think school officials' liberal perspective on society hindered the recognizing how choice really couldn't produce integration, and it also defended them against their anxieties about race. So both operations led them to adopt and to stay with. In other words, the question not simply why they adopt this policy, but why did they stay with this policy that avoided dealing with race. So I think we have a real complex story. I want to thank you for listening and invite you to talk about it with me. Yeah.
Where do you what do you, if something could have changed in history, what do you think would have been in order for schools to be integrated?
Well, I think we have to make, well, there's several different models. One is somebody sues, and then the courts mandate that whites and blacks go to school together, and whites and blacks adjust to going to school together. It becomes normal, and it becomes something they do, and it works. It works fairly well. That's one kind of model. So that's the coercive model forced by some on others using the vehicle of the court. That's one possibility. No one in Baltimore wanted to do that. The question is, and I guess one question is, how is it fair to judge people in 1954 sitting back here in 2011? But I think what's striking about the story is how little people talked about all the feelings and beliefs that kept whites from considering going to school with blacks. And identify some realistic questions that people had. Will my child be safe? Will my child learn? Will my child be distracted? I think what was important was at least to be able to talk about those kinds of questions and take the risk of going that far in addressing realistic considerations that seemed to be part of the story, not all the story, but part of the story in terms of limiting some white people from making choices, send their children to school with black people. But I think real limitation here is, I'm going to say something real simple-minded. People won't choose what they don't want to choose. And I think what we have here is a reluctance to take on and deal with whites' anxieties, unease about resistance to sending their children to school with blacks. So you can think about a coercive solution or more explicit public talk and see how far that gets you. But I think it's a hard question. There are different ways to try to get a handle on it. Yes?
You didn't mention anything about the Baltimore County school system, and it's been my impression since I moved to this area in 2003 that the Baltimore County school system lines were drawn intentionally to keep the white population around Baltimore City in its own school district so that the population within Baltimore City was concentrated and stayed in Baltimore City, and they didn't have to bus across lines because that wasn't what the agenda was. The agenda was to within a district. So do you have in any of your research? Or
well, there's several different pieces to the story. Once upon a time, this goes back, we'll take ourselves back to the 1930s, Baltimore County had segregated schools but no high schools for blacks. So if a black child got to high school age, then the Baltimore County Board of Education would administer a test. White children didn't have to take this test. But you want to go to high school, you have to pass the test, and if you do, then they would pay to send the child to a black high school in Baltimore City. What's Frederick Douglass High School today. They would send them there. But they didn't build a high school for black children, Baltimore County, making it very hard for black children, even those who lived in Baltimore County, to go to high school there. So that's sort of part of the cultural history, or the racial cultural history of the county. Baltimore City and Baltimore County are separate jurisdictions. They're also, in the state of Maryland, they're separate school districts. So there needs to be some formal understanding between separate school districts if they're to send children.
Right, but that's what I understand, is that they formed the two districts so that they were separate, so that they didn't have to have integration.
I'm not sure that's the motivation for it. That's the reason why the city and county lines got drawn where they were drawn. But then there's a different question, which is it's at a point, someone might have brought litigation, and there were lawsuits brought late 60s, early 70s to combine city and suburban school districts with two kinds of arguments. One, preponderance of white students in the suburb, preponderance of black students in the city. If you really want mixing, you have to combine the districts. And by the way, there are some practices in the suburbs which contributed to this segregation, and both they're part of the solution and part of the problem, and therefore it makes sense to do this. So there was a lawsuit in Charlotte, North Carolina, to combine city and suburban school district, and it went through, and eventually it became part of life and natural And I'm skipping ahead of the story. As Charlotte became a modern financial center, whites from the north came down, said, we don't like this arrangement, and have undone it. But it became normal for several decades. So that was a possibility for a period of time. Then I'm giving you a longer answer than you asked for, but finally in 1974, the Supreme Court came down with a ruling which said, essentially, it's next to impossible to combine city and suburban school districts unless you can prove by a very strict test that the suburbs caused segregation of city schools, and that's sort of an impossible test. So it becomes legally impossible to do this at this point. I mean, the Roberts Court recently said you can't deliberately desegregate schools on racial grounds. You want to end segregation, you have to do it by some way other than considering students' race. So I think it's getting really hard. I think the situation is what you described, but I don't think it got put together in quite the conspiratorial way that you're asking about. But the results are similar. Other? Yes.
Looking at where we are now with the advent and growth of charter schools in the city, how do you see that fitting into the story that you played?
Say a little more about what your question is.
I think your point is really interesting, that we seem to be moving along and still not talking about race, and I think that's still the case, but it's curious that, I'm not curious, it's interesting that this solution has come up which plays into the whole concept of choice. But I wonder sometimes about the impact on the extant schools, and so would like to hear sort of how does your story then pick up the line around charters?
Yeah. Choice is a means to an end. It's a strategy for accomplishing goals. Some goals it's good for, some it's not good for. It's clearly not a good strategy for desegregating schools because whites don't want to choose. The record in Baltimore is whites don't want to choose to send their children to school with blacks. That's not a good strategy for that end. Today, as Lisa said, Baltimore schools are 88 or 89% African American. You can do anything you want. Choice is mandatory. No strategy is going to lead to racial mixing in the cities. I mean, a different question, but my experience of choice, and when we start to mix charter schools and choices to send children to private schools and choices to move to counties, it gets blurred, but my sense is families have choice in relation to their income. So choice, I think, benefits families in lots of ways, but insofar as it removes them from schools that they choose out of, it harms those schools by removing whatever their assets are from those schools. There's also, and then I'm not sure if this is all part of the story, there's also a magical belief. It's the waiting for Superman fantasy. It's really a marvelous fantasy, but the fantasy is if only enough people choose enough things, everybody will be stimulated to do things no one knows how to do. And the schools that people don't choose because they may not be succeeding, they will somehow pull out of a hat magical programs that will educate children. It's as if they'd only been waiting for the prod to pull something magical out of the hat, as if it's that simple. I don't think it really stimulates improvement. I think it benefits those who have real choices, but I think it's a strategy for changing a school system, which is the other burden we put on it. It's more a matter of fantasy than realism. Yes?
What would be needed in order to initiate propagated change in the current school system?
What would be needed in order to
Initiate and propagate change in the current school system? I know you said, like, basically identifying how race does exist would be something that needs to be addressed by the school system, but then how can that be achieved?
What would you like to see it look like at the end? If it came out the way you wanted it, what would it look like? Then we can figure out how it would get there. Do you have a thought? I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I wondered if you had a thought about that.
I think it would take a matter of changing the mindset of not only the black population, but also the white population. Because you can't
Sure.
do anything, you can't move on or press forward if someone's determined to remain in a certain stance or mindset and they refuse to engage in change or something that would help the system.
Yeah. we talk about having a conversation about race. And I guess a couple of questions. One, what's the conversation supposed to be about? And the other one is, why are we succeeding so well in not having this conversation? I mean, what are our incentives not to have the conversation? I think one of the purposes of having such a conversation is for white people and black people to have contact and see one another as more or less ordinary people and dispel some of the fantasies we have, which make us do really quite crazy things, and they end up having the effects of keeping schools segregated. I mean, in the end, we need somehow to change some of the beliefs we have, which get in the ways of our having contact with people of different skin colors from ourselves. And I'm not saying that's easy or magical, but I think that's a piece of what we need to do. If we want to get people to have contact with one another, there's some coercive ways we can do that, and then people may say, okay, now that we're here together, let's see if we can try to get to know each other well. But I think you're right, so it's a question we need to wrestle with.
That's a great segue into getting to know each other well around the refreshments that we have. I hope you join in thanking me. Thank you, guys.